So we're creating an event right now, and it's being filmed, so in some ways it's a film too, which it may or may not help to think about that. I don't know. Okay, so if you haven't been here before, I know everyone, I don't know you, but I'm Robert.
I'm Rachel.
Rachel, nice to meet you. Thanks a lot for coming. So, and yeah, so if you haven't been here before, this is the Jewish History Museum of Tucson. And this is the last event that I'm going to be doing here, actually, like as a resident of Tucson. I will be coming back to do things, but this is the last one while I'm living here. So it's really significant to me because this place has, and I'm saying this not to, like, well, I don't know why I'm not saying it, but I am saying it because, like, part of what I want to do in this introduction for the poet who's here is I want to bring a kind of attention to the space that we're in, and also let kind of us know that a large part of what we're doing tonight is Julie Carr is coming and then is entering into a conversation with this space through her past and through her work, and because this is the first synagogue or the first space for Jewish worship, public space for Jewish worship, built in Arizona, right? And so what this place has been for me is I remember the first time I came in here and it was really dark, but it was like kind of during the day, and I think it was almost summer, and it felt dusty and opaque, and I was like, what is this place, you know? And then I went into the Holocaust History Center and I was like, wow, this place is amazing, you know? And I was really attracted to that place, and in a lot of ways that's why I started working here. But I've come to really find maybe more significance in this space even. And I'm not sure why, but it's cultivated a lot of questions that I've been asking myself about what is my history as a white American Jew? Like, where do I come from? What does my body mean in this place? Who is here? So women organized to create this, to build this building and raise the money for it. This was one of them. And what I know and what I tell students who come here is that she was only able to really start this kind of project once her husband passed away, because a lot of the early Ashkenazi Jews, or Jews coming as immigrants from Europe, in order to enter into the white power structure, which they were invited into, had to essentially hide or downplay their Jewishness. So essentially, Ashkenazi Jews were living in this area for 60 years before the idea of a synagogue even came up, you know. And something that's interesting is that this being the first synagogue in the city, while a lot of the people who it would serve were in pretty substantial positions of power when it was being built, was specifically built in this neighborhood, which was the neighborhood of color for people of color in the city. So you had pretty much almost all of the African American, all of the Asian American, and all of the Mexican American people living in this neighborhood, which was much larger before it was destroyed in the 60s. So why was this building for white Jews who were accepted into the power structure that was represented by downtown and north of the railroad tracks built here? And I've recently learned that, like in Russia, for instance, around the same time, there were laws that synagogues couldn't be built within a certain proximity to a church. And I imagine that was why it was built here, you know. So these are just things that I'm thinking about recently. And I think in some way, the way that Julie got here was we were hiking a mountain in Scotland, which you can do in like 3 hours. But nevertheless, it's the highest mountain in Scotland. And we had spent a week together there, and I was thinking about Alzheimer's, and her mother had passed away, I guess a year and a half around, a year and a half before we were together in this situation. And I'm very Jewish identified and talk about it a lot, and it's a part of my work. And so I was talking about Alzheimer's, and I was talking about Jewishness, and we were hiking a mountain in this place that was foreign to us. And she just told me, you're making me think a lot about my mother. You know, I think whenever someone says that, it always feels like really significant. And we didn't know each other that well then, you know. And then we started talking about her and her work as an activist and as a lawyer, and her influence on Julie and Julie's relationship to Jewishness and its complexities. And yeah, it just felt like we wanted to bring her here. So I've done a little bit of work to describe like where we are right now. And Julie's written a lot of books. She runs this incredible space in Denver, and I lived there, and that's where we met. And the space for me was like really articulated the importance of Denver in a lot of ways. And I think it's grown even beyond what I knew it to be, but it's a community garden. It's a space for like really innovative and really deep and worked through avant-garde, like visual art, but also literature. But at the same time, it's trying to service these questions around, around racism and around what it means to be in a society together, around gentrification, through opening itself up to like programming that maybe subverts what their traditional audiences were looking for, you know, and really pushing the boundaries between like what can happen in this other space and what can happen between those spaces, you know, this space where people who just want to go and talk about art go, but are also part of these gentrifying and in a lot of cases racist structures. And so, you know, yeah. So she has some books on the table. I think we're also here to celebrate a book that just came out, which she'll be reading from. And so with that, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So hi, folks. Thank you for coming. I'll just tell you sort of how we imagine the structure of this evening. It looks like everyone has something to write with, except for maybe, is it Kate? Cat. So if you want to grab some paper and a pen, what we thought we would do, or I would do, is read to you, and what I have here is some prose, newly written kind of for this evening, and some poems, and all of it pertaining in one way or another to my mother, and either directly or sort of tangentially to her Jewishness and her activism. And in among that, I'm sort of thinking aloud about some of those topics. So what I'll do is I'll start to read, and then at a certain point, sort of 4 minutes, the readings will be sort of 4 minutes to 9 minutes long, and I think there's 3 or maybe 4 little sections. And in between, we'll write, or you'll be invited to write. You don't have to write. So I have this little sound maker, which is going to sound like this, and that'll mean time to start writing if you want, and then I'll go like this, which will mean time to stop writing if you want. And it would also be completely okay with me if you started to write and you didn't really feel like stopping, and I start talking again, and it's not rude, it won't upset me if you just keep writing. It's also okay if you start to get uncomfortable in your seat and you want to, move or sit on the floor or something like that. That's also totally okay. And then, so all of that together, starting in a second till the end, will take about 40 minutes. And then when that's done, then I thought it might be really great to share a little bit anything you wrote. It could be like one sentence or a whole paragraph or nothing. Or we can talk more about kind of, what's on our mind. Okay? Sound good? All right, cool. So starting with an epigraph from a theorist named Colin Diane, who writes about the law, but also about poetry. And she says, "To think of poetry as a record of suffering and a mode of deliverance is to puzzle out an alternate reality." Colin Diane. She painted peace signs on my face and took me down to the river. Later, I painted them myself and jumped on the bed singing, "When you coming home, Dad? I don't know when, but we'll get together then. We'll have a good time then." Outside, the kids kicked a can, or I did, or we smoked. It was a country's birthday, and we didn't love it because we'd been raised to resist it. And what that meant when I was 3, and when I was 10, and when I was 13 was something like fashion, or it had to do with the people we knew. Annie was a Buddhist and wouldn't kill a bug. Anita brought her baby to babysit for me. Will drew cartoons at night, made omelets in the morning, and watched us in the afternoons. And Rocky was an artist and just a little bit mean. This was activism then, this being a mother who went to work and rallied a crew to watch the kids. This was an anti-war protest. But to say I was raised in the anti-war protests was also to say I understood something about crowds who gathered outside and shouted together for a thing we needed. She used to say, it wasn't politics that got to me, it was the neighbor's son. She liked to say that, so maybe there really was this neighbor and this boy who went away and didn't come back. The crowds were fantastic, is how I remember them. And to be raised in those crowds was to know that whatever we were going to fight for, it was these crowds, to sit in the sun with strangers and look up at a stage where someone was singing. Later, I'd climb a tree. Later still, I'd get myself there on a bus or occupy the admin building. It was abortion rights or anti-nukes or divestment, or later still, Marisa and I protested the war by making pamphlets in which we defined the terms: Desert Storm, Persian Gulf, Iraq, Kuwait, International Energy Agency, oil fields. We passed these pamphlets out on street corners. We hadn't a clue what we were talking about. We wanted a clue. We wanted to talk. The neighbor's son came to mind. We were 24. But let me go back. My mother was a Jew, which meant to me a few things. It meant we were never fully in with the Christians, never fully in with my dad, who wasn't really there anyway. When you coming home, Dad? I don't know when. It meant whatever America was, we weren't quite. We were, however, in this not quite being, never alone, because Jewish was always a thing you were with others. It was always and only a gathering, or also it was fire. In every instance in which our being Jewish was announced, there was fire and there was wine. Did I think her activism was also her Jewishness, that these things were somehow one or twinned? I'd say I did, because above all, to be Jewish was to feel things. She cried while driving and raged while cleaning. She kissed me long, and when she said goodbye, she held me tightly, and when she said hello, she jumped up and down. The other Jews at the gatherings laughed loud, and when they disagreed, they shouted and sometimes pounded the table. If to be Jewish was to feel things, and if to be Jewish was to be a thing with others, together and apart from something unspoken, white Protestant America, which had a few names but in fact had no name because it was the general air, this was also what it was to be an activist, to climb a tree and look out over thousands, to march and sing together, to fall asleep against a stranger on a bus. I'm speaking about activism as if it has no cause, no particular agenda. But this is not really true. The agenda was always clear and always one thing. We marched for each other. We marched for being together. We marched for the feeling that anyone, anywhere was also us. To be chosen turned on the idea that we had once and so always would be enslaved and had been freed, but only freed into exile. And these truths, which were never history, but were always story, and so more present than a history could ever be, meant that anyone enslaved, anyone in exile, anyone demanding freedom was also us. But I'm also speaking of activism as if it is only this marching and shouting. Now I would say that that is wrong. What does it mean to utter the phrase, "a thing I am with others," and use it to generate something more, something necessary? This is the question I want to ask. So. Iliadic familias with insertions from Homer. My mother used to cry in the car while driving. This was terrifying to me in the back seat. Not only was she responsible for my safety, but I could not see her face. And now I cry in the car while driving. My children behind me fight over who gets to hold the twist tie. This is a particularly deadly fight. I turn the news up so as not to hear them. I want to hear the mother who is talking about her dead son so that I can cry. Sometimes they ask me why I am crying. I always say, the war. This is how they come to be against the war. It is also how I came to be against the war that made my mother cry. She used to say, it was not politics that got to me. What did I care about politics? It was thinking about the neighbor's son. This is the famous fierceness of mothers. We do not want to listen to our children fighting because it will distract us from the war which is making us cry. One mother says she opens the newspaper and immediately begins to cry even before she reads anything. Another cannot watch child in danger movies. This is also true for me to an extreme degree. Once I was up half the night worrying for a girl in a movie who'd had her appendix out. The surgery was placed in the plot in order to bring her uncle and his boyfriend back together. Their concern and love for the girl was a sign of their continued love for each other. This I knew. I also knew that it was fiction. However, I could not sleep because they never showed the girl back home. In the final shot, she was asleep in the hospital bed. We were meant to be thinking about the two men who loved each other. We were meant to be thinking about love and how it is not the exclusive property of parents or heterosexuals, but belongs to everybody. But I wanted the girl to wake up. In the morning, I told my husband, and he was furious with me. He wants me to be able to watch movies, and it is more and more evident that I can no longer watch movies. This, according to my husband, is a pathetic failure to be objective, rational, and to have fun. 2. My mother used to cry in the car while driving to stop the sorrowful fighting. This was terrifying to me in the back seat. We shall fight again afterward until the divinity chooses between us. Not only is she responsible for my safety, but she gives victory to one or the other. And now I cry in the car while driving. By this time, the terms of death hang over us. My children behind me fight. There is no sparing time for the bodies of the perished. This is a particularly deadly fight. Standing there in their midst, I turn the news up high. Now the sun, rising out of the quiet water and the deep stream of the ocean, speaks of the mother who is speaking about her dead. As they wept warm tears, they lifted them. Sometimes they ask me who I am crying. In the same way, on the other side, their hearts in sorrow. She used to say, "It was not politics. What did I care about politics? Is there any mortal left on the wide earth who will still declare to the immortals his mind and its purpose?" This is the famous fierceness of mothers. We do not want to listen to these children because it will distract us from what makes us. There is little breathing space in fighting. This is also true for me to an extreme degree. My desire has been dealt with roughly. Their mutual concern and love for her was a sign of their love for each other, said one to the other. "Obey to the end this word I put upon your attention so that you can win for me the lovely girl." But they never showed the girl back home. "Tell me now, you muses, how fire was first thrown. We were meant to be thinking of love as property, but wanting the girl to wake up, I never did. Drinking from a spring of dark running water, willing her to wake. In the heart of each one was a spirit untremulous, and he wants me to watch. He is furious. Your mother nursed you on gall. You have no pity. This is a failure to be. You would gather in groups to have fun, to be rational, yet the desire in your heart is to watch the grim encounter. 3. My mother, an unearthly noise. I could not see her face. As wolves make havoc among lambs over who gets to hold the black earth, burdened so as not to hear them by the works of men, I turned to the neighbor's son, huddled inside his movie. He in the dirt face downward was also true for me, mouth open to the bright spear, willing him to wake. The heart in my breast was balanced between two ways, was pathetic, as if he were my child, as if where the beating is enclosed in the arc of the muscle is a failure to ration, to be, a lowing bell, a bellowing. For the mother, there is this constant and in some ways unbearable moving outwards. The sense of being someone who owns herself is always and forever compromised by the presence of the other as an in and of you. Of course, this is one way to understand simply being a person, any person, who knows herself to be attached. As Judith Butler puts it, writing about loss and grieving in a way that is, I think, informed and infused by her Jewishness. On one level, I think I have lost you only to discover that I have gone missing as well. Butler argues that these very ties, intensified by grief or desire, allow us to see how we are never simply a singular self, but are always bound up with otherness, and for that reason, unbound, undone. Let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something, she says. She's arguing that a truly just society must be based on such an understanding of how loss and desire make us vulnerable, make us, all of us, open to the wounds that are also our bonds. Perhaps it doesn't go far enough to say simply, as many have, that we are not ever singular, are always bound to these others who, because of love, make us, or those who, because of maternity, we could be said to have made. Maybe to say this doesn't go far enough because it reinscribes the ways in which we find ourselves most attached to those with whom we seem to share blood or home. Blood and soil. And here I want to make a claim that it is at once a paradox. For what is the home, the family itself, or even the clan or community, if not in some ways a hostile environment? even as it is the center of our most felt falling, our falling in love, our falling inward, that is at the same time a move outward towards these others. Why would I say hostile? For women, of course, there's the hostility of being under patriarchy, living under patriarchy. To become a mother is to enter into a contract with a brutal force that wants only to obliterate you, not the child, but the society that sees you as at once only a conduit for that other, the child, and at the same time the reason for all its failures, your narcissism, your desire, your pride, your demands, your weakness. All of these qualities are trumped up again and again to degrade you. Patriarchy, even now, makes of the domestic space, the family, the experience of motherhood, a hostility. But the family, home, clan, is a hostile environment in another way too, for it is where we learn the notion that we belong in a space of the particular. Kinship itself is a walled garden, and like all walled spaces, it invites violence. The light of is on anger. The recalibration theory of anger posits that anger is developed through the process of natural selection as an effective bargaining tool. Or anger is simply an alternate way out of difficulty when all other ways are blocked. Or we are trying to master our fear, to calm our anger, to restrain our weeping. When thinking about anger, I see my mother. Is this true of you? I'm stuck in a font. My compass can't get around that bouquet, delicate tendrils and shoots. Was told many times as a child, it's okay to be angry. Lilies lose their verve, that crack in the cup lets nothing out. We are trying to raise a son, a daughter, raise a garden, raise a son, a daughter, a garden, trying to raise a son, a daughter, a garden. Studies show stronger men and more attractive women are more anger-prone, feel more entitled to better treatment, and prevail more in conflicts of interest. The president is derided for not being angry enough. When we turn from anger, we turn from insight, said Audre Lorde. Or maybe the creation of an enemy is a loss. Strength and beauty are not unique. Anything that increases the social bargaining power of an individual should increase her or his anger proneness and feeling of entitlement. Then there's the state trait anger scale. Entirely contingent, the body of a little girl hanging around the house with not much breathing space. In the margin to my left, a butcher and a noose, forever muffled like winter trees. My mother was neither tall nor beautiful. In the jargon of the 80s, she was a rage addict. My adolescent son grips his head at the table and then quite literally screams. Still, others say that anger in its legitimate form has its roots in feelings of injustice. If hereby I drill into the earth, a hole big enough to deposit myself and my children, what dictionary could define us then? What camera record us? In the jargon of the 70s, she was a strong woman, not necessarily a good thing. Aristotle's term for the irascible person is slave or fool. Persons who do not become angry when we expect them to are, in our day, more likely to be described as repressed. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger had everything to do with the Holocaust, and so was genetic. In the social foreclosure of grief, we might find what fuels violence. As to my left, a butcher muffled. I began to keep a headache notebook in which I wrote down everything I ate or drank and the time of eating or drinking, then whether I had a headache or not, and the level from 1 to 10 of that pain. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger had everything to do with her feminism and so was justified. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger had everything to do with her father's anger and so was inherited. At the same time, I began to keep a race diary in which I wrote down every social encounter I had during every day, the name or occupation of the person I was encountering, the level of intimacy between us on a scale of 1 to 10, and the race of that person. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger had everything to do with my father's supposed infidelity and so was retributive. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger was only the flip side of her great capacity for joy and so was necessary. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger was not about me and so was bearable. To my left, winter trees. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger was a motive cause for her activism, and so was heroic. One might have said, and I did say to myself, that my mother's anger was an expression of her fear, and so was forgivable. Sometimes, on approaching our front door, my heart would begin to race. My husband asked me whether the headache journal and the race diary were connected, since I'd started them on the same day, and whenever I wrote in one, I also wrote in the other. A common belief is that children who experience high levels of rage in the home repeat these patterns in their own homes as adults. The rain falling now for 7 days without sun, the rain falling now for 7 days. Anger is an object mood, whereas depression is not. I had to admit that the two journals were connected, but I wasn't sure how. I thought I might discover in what way they were connected once I had completed the 1-month cycle I had committed to. The failure of the Jews to resist or rebel is often attributed to a failure of anger or simply to too much trust. We were German, but the Jews I grew up with subsequently were anything but trusting, animated. Chatter of something eating in the heating vent. The cold outside is unfathomable and stuck. Windows become violent and foreign. I feel afraid. The first and most noticeable thing about my race diary is that I very rarely rate my intimacy level to be higher than a 4. The second most noticeable thing about my race diary is that I often do not know how to classify a person's race. But what would I do about your anger, said one boyfriend upon breaking up with me. In an attempt to be not angry, I hit my head against the bathroom wall. The first and most noticeable thing about my headache diary is that my head hurts every single day. Often when I am angry, I wonder how my face looks and figure it does not look good. Do men ever figure that? Rousseau, all women possess the art of concealing their anger, especially when it is strong. The third most noticeable thing about my race diary is that I do not know what constitutes a social encounter. I finally stopped being angry when I realized, begins the memoir, begins the memoir, begins the memoir. The second most noticeable thing about my headache diary is that I do not know how to rate pain. She finally stopped being angry only a few years before she got sick. A terribly brief reprise. Ruinous children undo themselves in the harsh light of what is. She had calmed her anger only to find fear the master and weeping unrestrained, trying to raise a son, raise a daughter, a garden, and in the margins, branches heave. Patriarchy even now makes of the domestic space, the family, the experience of motherhood a hostility. But the family, home, clan is a hostile environment in another way too, for it is where we learn the notion that we belong in a space of the particular. Kinship itself is a walled garden, and like all walled spaces, it invites violence. The orchard walls are high and hard to climb, and this place death, considering who thou art. If any of my kinsmen find thee here, says Juliet to Romeo, in that play whose true battle is not between Montagues and Capulets, but between the enforced boundaries of family, name, property, kinship, and the freedom and anonymity of erotic love and desire. And so perhaps to call on the intimacy of familiar love, as Judith Butler does and as I do when I try to imagine what our activism might be aimed at and what it might most want, would not be enough, would be worse than not enough, would in some sense return us to the violence that makes us. How might being Jewish or being a mother then guide us instead toward an ever-expansive community of unwalled desire? Ethics demands the discomfort of complete relatedness, writes Colin Diane. How might we turn, in another way of saying it, to the neighbor's son? I believe that we will win. After the meeting with a Republican staffer in DC, we were met by the wind, which blew pretty hard 3 days long, but finally calmed at the end of Saturday when I wandered down to the caged and lit White House to join up with everyone to vigil, stay awake, for our right to speak, but found myself first folding into another group marching and chanting for immigrant rights. I had the wrong sign, but I got right in step. Education, not deportation. And then we made a circle, and soon we were yelling, I believe that we will win, I believe that we will win, and jumping up and down, all 800 of us, jumping up and down to the beat of the chant like children and joyous, and I started to cry. Then, later, on the subway, after our rally, vigil, march, I was on the train, tired, reading with my little cardboard sign that said, Prez, read a book, leaning on my shin, and a guy across the car said, James Baldwin, and I said, right. It was my mother's copy of Another Country, which I had no business bringing to DC, as the pages were ripping, the back cover having fallen off, and I wanted to preserve her notes, though I couldn't read them. It was the Dell edition from 1962, having been purchased before my birth for $5.95. She read it, no doubt, in the years she was an organizer of the anti-war and civil rights movements in Cambridge, activities I was born into, carried into, strolled into, such that these rallies and marches fill my early memories vaguely, like extravagant dances I only half dreamed of. Across the advertisement for Dell Books that makes up the book's final page, special offer, buy a Dell book for only 50 cents. She has written something in black ink. I can read only this. Once, mother, tree, black people. Soon or immediately, my co-passenger and I are deep in it, Baldwin in Paris, and why did he go, and what it had meant for my co-passenger to have read The Fire Next Time as a teenager, and his brother too, who had been in the military, and who, having traveled the world, would always say there was nowhere more racist than America. Then we leaned closer, and with even more urgency, how can we have a president who hasn't read Baldwin or anyone else, who cannot read or write, whose policies and language seek to entrap, disable, deport, disinform, and destruct, so that suddenly it was our stop, and the doors were almost closing, and we bolted and made it out, first him and then me. I stood still for a time, unsure whether in fact this was my stop, or if instead I just leapt, because he had, and I wanted somehow to stay with him. I flew home the next morning through an alarmingly bumpy sky with a gift of Bomb magazine sticking out of my bag, and there I read the incredible poems by Francis Richard, one that speaks of the Nigerian girls, saying only girls in such a way that we know which girls, but as if they are all girls, and her care, Francis's, makes a space for the broken heart to break more. I will give you her question, how to notate distance, terror, and only answer that she does, because writing, because books are the social project. Once only, again and again. Once only, again and again, imagine the morsel, if possible, of Jewish resistance. The charred chair, no windows, more mournful far arrests, the red and the black, the unburied. Once and once again once, a woman comes through the door, pushing her hair back from her face, a hedonistic moment, like poetry night in Glasgow, or like a seaside town where teenagers film themselves reading from notebooks while sitting on statues in the winter. Imagine, if you can, their flowing flower eyes, so that you might once and once again address the state with a little mouth full of water.